and thank you. That's really great to know. I think, as you saw, my notes are kind of in many different places, so I'm going to probably be going back and forth. I started using an external monitor recently, which has made reading a whole lot easier for me. Highly recommend it. So if I'm looking off screen, it's because I have a bigger screen over here, which makes it easier for me to read. Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump in. I'd first like to talk a little bit about kind of where I'm approaching this from. As we know, I sat in on those 3 virtual workshops. I read through the materials. I sat in on the original presentation that Sam gave for the team. And I'm aware that a lot of things have changed, and that things will continue to change. But in my mind, anything that I'm offering that is kind of specific to the digital can be translated to in-person workshops or to hybrid workshops. With that being said, I think it's important to locate myself in this, because I'm kind of someone who came into access consulting by accident, by virtue of being a disabled person who was advocating for myself in spaces. And then that resulted in arts organizations being like, hey, more access insight. And so as a result, I'm aware that there are definitely gaps in my knowledge. And those are gaps that have to do with both my personal experience as a disabled person myself, and also gaps in knowledge around access, accommodations, and foundations of access that I had not been exposed to. So I would love to offer readings on theory and everything, but that's not actually where my training is from. My training is from experience. But that being said, there are a couple of articles. There's actually a lot of research that I did as part of gathering information for feedback that I would love to share as well. Also, in terms of looking at myself, I'm a white, multiply disabled settler, and as somebody who is multiply disabled and came into disability as an adult, or came into disability as an identity as an adult, there are certain parts about my lived experience with disability, neurodivergence, and mental illness, which shape my perspective around how younger people, how children and youth may be navigating issues that they are not even aware of. For example, I've been low vision, in fact, legally blind for most of my life, and I had no words for that until very recently, because I just knew it as part of how I live my life. As a result, accommodations weren't something that I ever asked for, because I've never known anything different. And now suddenly I'm using an external monitor, and wow, it's so much easier to read all of a sudden. And that kind of brings me into kind of my first area that I'd like to cover, which is foundations of access. Access is for everybody. That's a really great phrase, and not a lot of people really understand what it means. When I say that access is for everybody, what I mean is that accessibility is often talked about in the context of accommodations. Accommodations being something that is given or granted rather than and added on or changed to existing programming, existing ways of doing things. And one of the things that I try to strive for, and that I encourage others to try to strive for, is access-centered planning. Having the idea of accessibility for all participants, all users, all stakeholders to be at the core of how one conceptualizes planning, one conceptualizes modes of communication, and one conceptualizes possible interactions. And with that being said, it is very possible that that any access features or intentionally planned access, any intentionally planned initiatives towards access won't actually reach anybody who requires those accommodations, and that's okay. That could easily be seen as a waste of time, money, or effort, when actually it is an offer that is not being taken up, and it's better to have that offer than to not. Just as offers of turning your camera on in Zoom or turning your camera off in Zoom are offers that one may or may not use. With that in mind, scrolling. Yeah, so access is for everyone also means that right now, the three of us are talking on Zoom. I'm speaking in like verbal English, and based off of the like nonverbal reactions that I'm getting from the two of you, it appears to me that you may be understanding me. That means that your needs in this space have been accommodated, and that my need for communicating my information has been accommodated. Congrats. And the reason why I'm saying congrats is because that's often how accommodations are approached. Like, congratulations, we have offered you something. And that's not necessarily something that keeps in mind that access is for everybody. If there's anything that I can do in this meeting that can make the information that I'm delivering more accessible to either of you or to anybody watching the recording, please let me know. With that in mind, it takes a lot of extra work and a longer time to set up accessible structures. And a lot of the information that I'm going to offer is actually labor that would be taken on by the facilitators. And I recognize that. I recognize that as potentially antithetical to how many people approach facilitation, especially on a like moment-to-moment kind of sign up for whenever you're available kind of drop-in basis that facilitators may be engaged in. But it actually provides a more holistic framework. A lot of what makes online learning during the pandemic either extremely accessible for some or extremely inaccessible for others is that it makes visible and makes more apparent access needs that are already in place. There are many things that I was not aware of myself as access needs until I started working from home all the time, and wow. So intentionality and planning, and keeping space for both the intention that needs to go into that and any frustration that might come from that is okay. I'm going to move on to the next section, but before I do that, I will say that any feedback that I'm giving on the way that Sam approached facilitating those workshops is not a criticism, and it is in fact, I would like to applaud the efforts that have been made and offer just different ways of thinking about them. So let's talk about universal design and learning. UDL is kind of a framework for conceptualizing education, which has been applied primarily in education settings, but also in performing arts settings as well. I read some really fantastic research on how it's being applied in dance right now, which is very cool. And UDL is basically a way of conceptualizing access for everyone for students. How lesson plans, assignments, and expectations for classroom setups can be customized to the learning needs of the individual, thus therefore not creating a binary or a system of accommodations, because that work has already been in place to intentionally plan for many modes of engagement. And UDL concepts have been kind of instrumental in the ways that I've been thinking about the PAN programming. So I'm going to take a moment to scroll through my notes, but if there's any commentary or anything that you need clarified, this would be a great time for that. Okay. So let's talk about questions? No? Cool. So let's talk about setting the space. Setting the space is going to be, again, kind of where a lot of that intentionality comes off the top. One of the things that was really apparent to me during the PAN sessions, and that is often apparent to me as a facilitator myself, is time. Time being of the essence, time being a constant pressure, and time being something that is prioritized above all else. And that is completely understandable. That's how we are conditioned to think. That is how we are conditioned to view like the ways we engage with others, especially during the pandemic. And what I would like to offer is that it does not matter if all the material is gotten through. And that might sound really intense or really scary, but that's actually something that I'm offering more as a reassurance. If all the information isn't gotten through, what is lost? If the show is rehearsed 2 times instead of 3, what is lost? If a scene is read in 15 minutes instead of in 10 minutes, what is lost? And the answer is there might be some things lost in terms of specific goals, but what is often gained by taking extra time is more thorough engagement. In setting the scene or setting the space for a workshop, it's important to remind the students of what the goals are of the program, what the goals are of the workshops, because that will help guide how time is managed. It will also allow students to get a better understanding of why time is being allocated to certain things. Setting the space and setting the kind of mode of interaction with time is something that I like. I like thinking about it kind of like a video game, like the tutorial level of a video game. No matter how many times you've played Super Mario, no matter how many times you've used the same platform, no matter how many times you've done that game, if anytime you restart it, they will always walk you through a tutorial stage. They will always tell you, this is where the controls can be found. This is how you pause. This is how you save. And setting the space also is kind of like that. Letting students know this is where you can get the information you need, no matter what. If it's on Brightspace, or if it's on Canvas, or whatever other, or Blackboard, or whatever other online platform the school is using, making it apparent from the very outset, this is where you can find your script. This is where you can find whatever page number we're on, whatever scene number we're on. I will always, for example, I will always say it when we are moving on to a different scene, or I will always put in the chat when we are moving on to a different scene. Making it apparent where students can find the cast lists. and where students can find a brief and very high level list of what the goals are for the day. This will help orient students towards what they need to know for the day. And it'll also end up saving time later in the workshops. There were several instances of students not being sure where their scripts were, not being sure where their what scene they were supposed to be on, or what where they were supposed to be. And that will always happen. And that's okay. But having that said from the outset kind of allows them to arrive in the space with what they need. So for example, if I'm walking into a workshop and I'm told, bring a pencil, bring a notebook, and bring clothes that you can move in, I will be able to think in advance, okay, do I have all these things? And if not, is there time for me at the very beginning of the day to just take 3 minutes to go make sure I have those things? So that's a way that time can be allocated towards making sure that students can settle in the space. Another important way to think about settling in the space is that we are coming into a classroom environment that is already established. There is a culture and modes of engagement that students may be accustomed to in this space, especially online. There's always going to be some teachers that require students to always be on camera or always be muted if they're not speaking. There will always be teachers who want students to raise their hand. There will always be teachers who have different ways of communicating with students, and it's important to actually get that information from the outset. Because if a facilitator is coming in and has a very strong idea of how they want students to get their attention, for example, Sam asked that students physically raise their hands. If students are not used to that, it can actually be destabilizing. Many students who are neurodivergent or disabled, and most of my recommendations for today are specifically looking at students who may be neurodivergent, will have routines and rituals of how they are meant to interact in specific spaces. In the world of neurodivergence, we often call this scripting. Scripts are what we follow in order to interact socially, in order to maintain a sense of control, and also a sense of, set expectations. So if a student is used to being able to give comments through using like the reaction hands in Zoom, and now they're being asked to physically raise their hand, that could actually cause a barrier, not only in just the physical gesture of that, but also in terms of having to reframe towards keeping the camera on and physically raising their hand. So checking in with the teachers before even the start of the workshop of how do you run your classroom. Also, I think is really important because it allows the teachers to be able to articulate that which they might not already have articulated. Like, oh yeah, like this is actually a rule that I've never necessarily said out loud. These are the kinds of scripts that my classroom follows, and that my students expect, which is also, always good to have more awareness towards what behaviors you're encouraging in your space. So checking in with the teachers, and then checking in for modes of engagement. Material needs, like I said, and also what the rules of the space are. So there are certain rules such as, how are you going to answer questions? Like, do you have to physically raise your hand? And stuff like that, which might be set by the teacher already. But if there are any new rules being introduced, even rules that are like, you can turn off your camera if you want to, or you have to stay muted if you're not speaking, those are rules that need to be reinforced every day. A lot of times, facilitators, directors, and many other people working in group settings will create kind of shared rules, comfort agreements, space agreements. Whether or not that is something that is engaged by the facilitator for these projects is something that I'm not sure if that's something that has been thought through on SAA side, but regardless, making it transparent, like why they exist and how they are going to be kind of, I wouldn't say reinforced, but encouraged, how these ways of engaging are going to be set. And this will allow students to, again, understand what script they're following, understand kind of it's like knowing what is being taken care of already. As a neurodivergent person, especially as an autistic person, I am constantly wondering what I'm allowed to ask for, constantly wondering what things are supposed to be already known, or what things are just known and I didn't pay attention. And offering that reassurance of these are the expectations for you will help students to kind of just have that background noise quiet down a little. Background noise of that anxiety around when can I ask questions? When can I ask for clarification on lines? When can I ask what scene we're on? How do I ask those questions? So saying, for example, if you ever need to ask what scene we're on, please do so in the chat, or please do so at the end of a scene. If you have a question about a line, please ask that after we're done reading through the whole scene, or please do that after you're done speaking the line. Just stating very clearly where the modes of communication are and where and when they're going to be encouraged. I often find myself in Zoom calls putting things in the chat because I'm not sure when I'm allowed to speak. So a common access feature, which is, again, both in person and over platforms such as Zoom, is start and end of thought. So for example, hi, this is Max speaking. I'm speaking, and when I'm done with my thought, I will say, end of thought, or that's it. And that allows participants, allows the other people I'm communicating with to know that I'm still trying to formulate my words if I'm pausing, because especially over Zoom, pauses seem a lot longer than they are. Other rules of the space that should always be reiterated: if participants are allowed to pass when they're asked a question, when it is their turn to participate in an exercise, reiterate that at every time there is that exercise. There is another exercise being introduced. That was one of the rules that Sam had set up, and I'm not sure how often it was reiterated across the different workshops. Oh yeah, just more things about like setting the space, about materials is also like do a tech check-in at the start. So if somebody's microphone isn't working, then you know, and it's less uncomfortable later on. We always want to encourage that however students need to show up, they can. And with that, there's something about the ways in which we ask students to show that they're paying attention versus paying attention, show that they're engaged, or show that they are ready to work. So, for example, there may be a no phones rule, either set by the facilitator or set by the teacher. So first of all, is that already in place in the classroom? Does that align with the current classroom culture? And second of all, why? Something I often genuinely ask is, why does it matter if a student is doing something else or is multitasking? And the answer is because for many people, multitasking doesn't allow them to engage. Whereas for people like me, if I'm not doodling all the time, while listening to somebody else speak, there is no way that I'm taking in a word of what that person is saying, because I need to have multiple things to keep me stimulated. I need to listen to music while I'm writing emails. I need to have another window open while I'm on a Zoom call, because it helps me process information. So one of the rules that was set during the first workshop by Sam was one for students to not have their cell phones, not have any other windows open, stuff like that. And completely understandable rule, but might actually cause more students to feel to be unable to engage how they best do. Offering a range of options for how students can engage will help students who might not know what they need try out different things. This is one of the concepts of UDL, is that students might not know what their needs are, so offer options and allow them to change when they need to. Checking in with students also about like what the content is of the play, and whether or not they are familiar with Shakespeare at all is actually really useful, even if it's something that we can just assume based off of the school curriculum, like, oh, they've definitely read a Shakespeare play before. Doesn't mean that they necessarily understood it, or doesn't mean that they're not new to the school, new to this way of approaching Shakespeare. And that also applies to setting the scene for how we're going to talk about text. One of the things that actually caused me to seek diagnosis for a learning disability was the fact that while I was in theater school, individual lines in Shakespeare, not being able to separate that an individual line is the start or the end of a thought was so difficult for me, because it goes against the script of what we already know in like standard North American ways of interacting with English and interacting with text. Letting students know that the end of a line is not necessarily the end of a thought can really help reading comprehension. Neurodivergent and disabled people spend our entire lives trying to figure out what the scripts are. And when they change, it can be really overwhelming. So part of making Shakespeare accessible is being really upfront about what the rules for reading Shakespeare are, how they differ from contemporary standard English as that they might be used to. One metaphor that I like giving for talking about like the difference between lines and thoughts is that it's kind of like texting. You might have the same sentence just in different texts for emphasis when you're messaging your friends. That's a really easy way to tell teenagers about it. And the other, so that's another really important thing for setting the space. And then the last thing that's really important to think about for setting the space is defining expectations of what they are doing before they do it. So for example, am I reading this passage for comprehension? Am I reading this passage for identifying what words or phrases might be unfamiliar? Am I reading this passage for understanding the character's point of view? Or am I reading this passage for getting a sense of how the language works, or what the flow of ideas are? And a lot of times, it's important to think about and articulate very clearly what you're expecting the students to gain from reading a passage, because then, again, they can just focus on that one task. If you're asking a student to simultaneously read for character and plot and words that they might not know, that's a whole lot of different ways of reading. And I have some ideas that I'll talk about a bit later on how students can actually be offered kind of interdependent ways of reading to support one another while focusing on different tasks. Oh yeah, really easy way to like make something, make information clear. Again, about setting the space, setting like where students can find information. Putting the cast list and in the chat for each scene as you're going through each scene, along with what page number you're on. Really easy. Makes it way easier, because then they know, okay, if I ever am not sure what scene we're on or who's in it, I know I can check the chat. And again, for like in person, that's just writing it on the chalkboard, writing it on the whiteboard. Just going through and seeing if there's anything else. Oh, another just thing about setting a space is checking in with students about what anxieties they might have about Shakespeare. This is actually something that I did when I was working at the COC, when I was working with younger children, is that on the first day, I gave them anonymous surveys of what do you know about music? What do you know about theater? Are you comfortable like doing a big role, a small role, a medium role? What genders they would be okay with playing? And also, what are you excited about and what are you anxious about? And not kind of offering these kind of gives a space for students to be able to say, hey, I'm actually not sure why we have to read Shakespeare. I'm not actually sure why I have to read. I'm not actually comfortable with reading in front of others. And also, you know, just things around kind of knowing that from the get-go, like offering that survey kind of in advance of the workshop will actually give the facilitator a lot of information about what kind of classroom they're walking into, and allows students to kind of check in with themselves as well. So that's setting the space. I think there's a lot of that is going to be repeated elsewhere, but I'm going to just pause to see kind of where we're at and what questions you have.
Oh, wow. There is a lot in there, and I can't wait to hear everything. No, it's great. It's great. It's great. It's great. It's really great, Max. Like, there's so much in there that I just want to tear each one of those things apart. And then by that I mean like really piece it out and like break it up thought-wise. So you've talked about UDL, you've talked about setting the space, and you've talked about time as a large aspect of setting the space. And I'm sorry, I'm just doing this so that I understand what I think I've understood because I've taken notes. Then you've talked about a lot of things around resources, culture management, and engagement, as well as a check-in with the students about their comforts, their anxieties, their knowledge or lack thereof. And then you've peppered a few different thoughts, like letting students know how to communicate an end of thought, for example, things like that. Purpose of why we're doing things we're doing. All of that, I feel like I understand where you're coming from. The thing, well, a couple of things maybe that I'm not super clear on. So, what you actually just talked about, the pre-programmed survey for the students, for the kids. As soon as you said that, I was like, we should have done that for summer camp. Because in our summer camps, we cast a show and we do a show in 2 weeks. That's what our summer camp is. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what their skill levels are and what they want to do by, throwing audition games at them and stuff without calling it an audition, just throwing them ways of engaging and just seeing how they do. And things do become apparent. And my fear with something like a pre-programmed survey is that you allow the kids' fears to determine what it is they will end up doing. Right? So if a kid believes they can't do something and they haven't had the opportunity to have a new experience and therefore have a new confidence or a new belief in themselves, are we allowing their preconceived notions to inform their new experience? And if not, how not so, I guess.
So that's a really great question, and actually something that I've wondered myself when I kind of started approaching that. And the answer for me is that you don't necessarily follow their preferences or their fears, but you allow them to inform. So kind of a sneaky way to do that is if a student is like, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable reading a large part, you don't necessarily give them like a major character to follow throughout the script, but rather you give them the same number of lines, but with a lot of smaller characters. So it doesn't feel like there's as much pressure because it's not somebody who is as responsible for the plot or emotional content, but it's still just as important to understanding the play. And it's kind of a reverse psychology thing. And still allows them to engage in different ways. One of the things that actually students might be anxious about when it comes to reading out loud is comparing themselves to others, especially when it comes to if a student who is having trouble with the language, it might not sound natural, might not sound like they know what they're speaking, which is actually something that I noticed kind of being reinforced in the workshops was the idea of it sounding good. But that has no bearing on whether or not the student understands what they're saying or can empathize with their character. So if you have a student who may be really worried about speaking about Shakespeare and you're assigning them Viola in 12th Night, that might feel like a lot of pressure, especially compared to some of the other students who may be a bit more comfortable. But if you're assigning them a smaller role, it still gives them significance, but alleviates that pressure. Or a smaller role, not actually in lines, but in terms of where that character fits in the plot.
Right. No, I think that's actually quite helpful. Just changing track a little bit. You mentioned a little bit about checking in with teachers as well as classroom rules. And I completely hear you, like saying to everyone, don't use your phones, when that's not actually the goal. The goal is engage. The goal is engagement. This is just something that we think should lead to higher engagement, which, as you've alluded to, on the whole, does. So there's no question in here. I guess I'm processing out loud that what you're really saying is say to students, what we want from you is engagement. And if the highest engagement we're going to get from you is if you put your phone away, then put your phone away. If the highest engagement we're going to get from you is that you are going to be doodling the entire time you're with us, then doodle the entire time you're with us. And I think the challenge I have is having seen some of the classrooms that we've been, I mean, you were in one of the best classrooms we had. My goodness, that teacher was so tuned in. That was amazing. He was fantastic. I'd hire him in a heartbeat. But I also saw classrooms in which the teacher was like, all right, and just disappeared as soon as we started. And classrooms in which I sent teachers questions about, hey, just can you answer a few questions about this? And it's sometimes difficult to get the understanding of classroom culture. And when that happens, I feel like it's too much to get an educator to just do it in the first 10 minutes of class and figure all of it out. So yeah, that's me just processing, going, not saying I can't do this, but I also recognize that there are classrooms in which this is harder to achieve than others. And navigation.
Yeah, you work with what you've got. And actually, it's really funny that you said that you would hire that teacher. And I do agree that he was definitely engaged and tuned in. But I also felt that there was a lot of pressure coming from him in terms of how he regulated how students were engaging. That was something that I noticed, was that there was one student in particular who seemed to have a really hard time with finding his script and with staying with what was going on. And I noticed that every time that student was having a trouble with his script, the teacher did jump in and say, oh, it's been on Brightspace for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Again, that's something that, like, for many students, oh yeah, it's been on Brightspace for 2 weeks. I got it. But for some students, that genuinely, like, if it's not immediately relevant, there's no reason to look at it. I have emails that are sitting in my inbox where I know I need to look at them, but I don't need to respond to them for another week. So I'm not looking at them because there's so much information about what I'm doing right now. And I don't know, for a lot of students who are juggling a whole lot of different classes, a whole lot of different commitments, that can be the same thing. So yeah, just offering that patience towards a student might not have their script, and just saying that outright, like, hey, just a reminder, this is where you can find it off the top, alleviates that pressure. That being said, it was great having the teacher like involved, and I totally hear you about some.
Yeah, I guess I mean, like, he cared about his students.
Yeah.
Not like he did everything perfectly. Like you said, I did think, but he was like a drama teacher teaching a drama class, and he was like, let's do drama, which I get it. It's not the same thing as an English teacher trying to chivvy a bunch of students and convince them to do this one Shakespeare, which also we had. Yeah, but I hear you. I think we tried to have the content ourselves, but so many teachers are like, oh, don't worry about it. I'll put it on Brightspace. So then I was like, oh, okay. I don't want to mess with your system. And then you say, oh, here's our system, play in our system when you have a system. And I think that's part of the tension. And so what I think I've learned, and from what you're saying as well, is let the teacher have their system, let the educator have access to a system as well. And let the educator be able to make quick offers of like, here's the link, drop it, use it. You know, the kid doesn't have to go looking through the Brightspace now, because
yeah, absolutely. And definitely being able to gauge like how like tuned in the teacher is to the workshop, how is totally important. And yeah, just kind of getting a sense of like where things are at and just reinforcing it. Kind of just makes everyone's lives easier. Yeah, is there, I'm also very aware of the time, so I don't want to add any new information. But yeah, is there anything else you wanted to ask about or you'd like me to clarify? Or any thoughts from you, David?
No thoughts. Taking all of this in, it makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, I don't think you can ever be too clear with the context of, what the rules of engagement are in a space. I don't, there's no harm in being too clear or too transparent or too open or peppering reminders in. It's not as if, that, annoys or disrupts or whatever any of the actual learning that takes place. I'm I'm thinking about time, which is, as you mentioned, something that we all wrestle with, and as we're wrestling with right now, it's like, oh my, but or not wrestling, but it's just like, oh, setting a time, and then it takes the time that it takes, right? And I'm curious about the PAN in particular as a project, or as one of our first programs in classrooms that are about the chronological action of the play. Like that, our other workshops are like, we do this activity and how was that? And, okay, we didn't have time for that, but, no harm lost. But the structure of the PAN and the focus being on, I guess it's a great question. Is there why the chronological action of the play? Like, is that important or relevant? I like to think that it is. And so if I think that it is, then, or like if we think that there's, why, and we can sort of tease out the why of the chronological action, how do we, how do we achieve chronological action? Means beginning, middle, and end. And so how do you get all that in a way that's fun, respectful, accessible? Like that's where I see, I guess, some kind of like I'm ready to chew on that, but I'm still that's what I'm sort of processing in my head.
I'm really excited that you said that, because I have the same kind of questions as well. And that's something that I will get to tomorrow, is around kind of how you can still be like, think about the beginning, middle, and end while still maintaining set expectations and like very defined goals of engagement for each workshop.
Yeah, actually 3 of our 6 educators fed back to me and went, in one of our sessions, we didn't finish everything and we decided that was okay. And I was like, yes, sorry, if that wasn't clear, that is totally actually okay. Like 3 classrooms did not finish the play. I said, oh, wow. They decided that rather than rushing to the end of the play to then put on a performance, they'd rather just explore every scene and that the kids understand every scene. So that at the end, they basically did sort of like a quick fire tableau and went, scene 1, this happens, go, tableau it. Scene 2, this happens. So the kids did get the action of the play. They didn't get to do a full play in connection. But I mean, that's just something we decided was important. Really, what's important is they know what happens in this play. And it's something we're trying to figure out. I'm so like conditioned to believe that the teacher needs to hide everything from the students in that power play of like, I know you have to wait until I am ready to tell you what you need to know, and just trying to break that while doing this of going, yeah, it doesn't matter if we don't finish everything. Point is that you learn, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we're all conditioned towards. Many of us are. And I guess the thing that I will kind of tease for tomorrow and let you chew on is, in terms of setting the space and rules of engagement, going back and forth between text, movement, and performance is really great for a lot of students, really, really not great for others, because it's different ways of thinking about how you're engaging. So if I know that the first day, I'm just going to be focused on learning what the play is and learning who the characters are and what the plot is. The second day, I'm going to be focusing more on like character embodiment and like performance and anything that is not the text. And the third day, I'm going to be focusing on putting them together. That can allow a lot more space for like allowing things to not get done while still not interrupting the chronological flow of the students understanding beginning, middle, and end, and how a text is not just a text. So that is my gift
Thank
for you
you.
to think about.
Thank you. I'm really glad that we decided on the two meeting structure. It seems like it's kind of what we needed. And thank you for your time and for being open to that too. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. And it's I also just want to apologize if it's